The door never stood a chance. The crash was so violent, the whole house seemed to choke for a second. That sudden kind of silence that only shows up right after something goes wrong. The impact left a crooked mark in the wood, like a fresh scar. And right there, in the middle of the chaos, stood Ryan. 10 years old, face flushed, chest heaving, eyes wide like he genuinely believed the entire world had conspired against him before breakfast. "I hate everything today," he shouted, as if the universe were listening. And because it was so over the top, so human, so painfully real, the scene became impossible to ignore, like watching someone lose control and realizing at the same time that it's not really about the missing object, but about something much deeper. Out on the porch, old Joe just watched. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't raise his voice. He was the kind of man who had already witnessed family wars much bigger than this, and some had actually started with less. The Midwestern breeze rustled through the backyard trees, lifting dry leaves that drifted around his boots. Even then, the only thing Grandpa Joe did was raise one eyebrow, slowly. No lecture followed. No, don't talk like that. No, calm down. When he finally opened his mouth, what came out was so unexpected, so absurd, that Ryan choked on his own anger. "If you yelled at the door, then go apologize to it." The sentence hit the ground like a glass shattering. Ryan froze. "What?" "You heard me," Joe replied, without raising his tone. "The door took your shout. Go fix that." It was ridiculous, offensively ridiculous. And that was exactly why the tension shifted. It was as if his grandfather had pulled an emotional rug out from under him. This wasn't about the door. It was about him. And Ryan felt that, even without understanding it. He kicked a shoe across the floor. "This is stupid, Grandpa." "Maybe, or maybe you're just not ready to admit what's really going on." Joe turned his face toward the horizon, leaving the boy alone with his irritation, and now with a curiosity he didn't want to feel. The house creaked. The porch boards, worn down by decades of feet and family stories, groaned as if reacting to the moment. The smell of coffee drifting from inside reminded him that the day was just getting started, even though Ryan had already wrecked half of it in under 5 minutes. The missing toy, a blue car he'd carried around since preschool, suddenly felt too small to justify such a scene. But the truth was that it wasn't about the toy. Not for Ryan, not at this point in his life. He felt, without being able to name it, a pressure in his chest that had been building up over the past few months. Maybe it was school. Maybe it was the feeling that his parents were always busy. Maybe it was the slow realization that growing up didn't feel as fun as it used to be. Whatever the cause, that morning's explosion was only the visible tip of an iceberg. "I'm not apologizing to a door," he muttered, arms crossed. "That's your choice, but choices shape who we become, even the small ones." Joe didn't need to raise his voice. His tone carried the weight of someone who had seen too many lives fall apart from a lack of control at the wrong moment. A neighbor walked by with his dog and waved. "Everything all right out here, Joe?" "Always," the old man answered, without glancing at Ryan. It was as if the boy didn't exist, and that stung more than the lecture Ryan had been bracing for. He felt the anger flare up again, but now it was mixed with something more uncomfortable, bruised pride. "Are you ignoring me?" "I'm waiting for you to think," Joe said calmly. "Thinking costs less than fixing things broken by anger." It didn't sound like advice. It sounded like fact. Ryan hated when his grandfather talked like that, because it hurt. And it hurt because it was true. The morning dragged on. Birds chirped from a power line, a milk truck rumbled down the street. A typical small American town where nothing ever felt urgent, except for the emotional storm inside a 10-year-old boy. He walked up to the door he had kicked. He looked at the dent, then at the floor. His breathing was still heavy, but less furious now, more tangled. Did it really matter? Apologizing to a door? What kind of lesson was that supposed to be? But behind that question lurked another, one he couldn't shake. Why does Grandpa think this matters? And that question was more unsettling than any apology. Joe stayed seated, unmoving. He knew exactly what was happening.
Ryan wasn't fighting a door, he was fighting his own emotional reflection, and he'd lose, like anyone does, if he kept running from it. The boy turned to his grandfather with a look halfway between defiance and pleading. "You really think this is going to change anything?" Joe took a long breath and, with the calm of a man who never needed volume to win, said, "It's not the door that changes. It's you." The words hung in the air, soaking into everything, the wind, the morning sun, the empty quiet of the yard. And for the first time, Ryan felt afraid, not of his grandfather, not of a scolding, but of what he was about to discover about himself. And the story began right there, not with the shout, not with the door, but in that quiet moment when a boy realizes that maybe anger is just the rough draft of what he might become, or what he might destroy. And he had no idea that this would be the day that followed him for decades.
The rest of the morning moved on with a strange stillness, as if the entire house were waiting for the next move. Not from Ryan, not from Joe, but from that invisible tension that settles between two people when a truth hasn't yet been spoken. The boy wandered around the living room like someone circling a sleeping animal, afraid to wake it. Joe stayed on the porch, unrushed, carrying the posture of someone who knows that certain lessons shouldn't be pushed, only invited. Ryan tried to keep himself busy, but everything felt off. The blue toy car was still missing. His room was a mess, and deep down, something inside him had started to bother him in a different way. A new sensation, a kind of weight behind his stomach that didn't have a name, though adults would easily call it a conscience. He glanced at his grandfather. Joe was tinkering with an old toolbox, adjusting something that didn't really need adjusting. It was just an excuse to stay there, present, steady. And that detail, that quiet presence, irritated Ryan more than any scolding could have. "You really think that whole talk to the door thing makes sense?" the boy blurted out, finally losing the battle against his own restlessness. "I believe in talking to whatever we hurt, even if it can't answer," Joe said without looking up from the screw he was turning. Ryan scoffed. "Doors don't feel anything." "And you?" Joe asked, lifting his gaze at last. "Do you feel anything?" The question pressed against his chest. The answer stuck in his throat. Deep down, Ryan felt everything. He felt anger, frustration, fear of losing things, fear of being ignored, fear of not being good enough. But he also felt an almost unbearable urge to understand what was happening inside him, and that was terrifying. Kids don't like admitting when they feel too much. Adults don't either. Joe noticed. He recognized that look. He had seen it years ago in the eyes of his own son, Ryan's father. The same pride, the same struggle dealing with what burned on the inside. "Grandpa, why don't you get mad at me?" Ryan asked without looking at him. That question, yes, caught Joe off guard. The old man rested his hands on his knees and took a deep breath, like someone opening a door inside a memory. "Because I've already wasted too many days getting angry about things that didn't deserve it." "And I do?" "No, kid. You deserve to learn." A gust of wind lifted dust from the yard, and for a moment, the two of them just stood there, looking at each other like two worlds recognizing themselves for the first time. The neighbor next door came out to water her plants. A car rolled down the dirt road, leaving a slow trail behind. The smell of someone's lunch cooking drifted in from a distance, reminding them that life kept moving, even when something inside us felt like it was melting. Ryan kicked a pebble across the ground. "You talk weird, Grandpa." "It's the age, and also because I used to be just like you." "I doubt it." Joe gave him a sad smile. "Everyone doubts it until they grow up enough to see their own reflection." The boy frowned. "It didn't make sense, and yet it did." Joe stood up slowly, the kind slow only people with years on their backs can manage, and walked over to the dented door. He ran his fingers over the mark left by Ryan's kick. We spend our whole lives hitting the wrong things, the wrong people, and sometimes even ourselves. Ryan stepped closer, curious despite himself. It's just a dent. Today it is, but tomorrow it could be bigger, and after that it can turn into a habit. And before you realize it, Joe looked straight into his grandson's eyes. You'll become the kind of man who regrets things too late. The words landed in Ryan's stomach like a punch. He didn't fully understand them, but he understood enough to feel afraid. It was the good kind of fear, the kind that points the way. "Grandpa, what do you want me to do?" he asked in almost a whisper. Joe stepped away from the door. "I don't want you to do anything. I want you to understand something." He sat back down in his porch chair. "When you yelled at the door, you thought you were letting your anger out, but really, you were feeding it. Every time you shout, it grows. Every kick teaches it that it can take over. And how do I make it stop? You don't stop anger by wrestling with it, you stop it by choosing something else instead." Ryan bit his lower lip. "Like what?" "Like breathing, speaking softly, thinking first, apologizing when you cross the line." The boy rubbed the tip of his shoe into the dirt, leaving restless marks on the ground. "Grandpa, that's hard." "Of course it is." Joe's smile was crooked, almost amused. "Control is always harder than losing control, but it's worth it." There was silence again, but this time a different kind, less tense, more meaningful. Ryan looked at the door again. Now it seemed smaller, not an enemy, not a symbol of shame, just a door. The real fight was happening inside him. "You think I can do it?" he asked in almost a whisper. "I think you already have," Joe said. The sun hit Ryan's face, and for a moment he looked older than he was, as if right then he had taken an invisible step out of childhood. He didn't apologize to the door. Not yet. But something inside him shifted, like a gear finally sliding into place. And Joe noticed. He always noticed. The afternoon stretched on slowly, but Ryan didn't explode again. He didn't yell. He didn't kick anything. Something had begun to change. And even though he didn't know how to name it yet, it was the beginning of a transformation many adults take decades to start. The door was still there, silent as ever, but now, for the first time, Ryan understood that it wasn't the door that was waiting, it was him. The afternoon began to lose its strength, and the shadows stretched across the yard like long fingers announcing the end of a cycle. There was something in the air that Ryan couldn't name, but could feel. A mix of shame, restlessness, and something that almost felt like courage. An uncomfortable kind of courage. The kind that doesn't show up in shouts, but in silence. The kind of silence that forces you to face what you did, what you felt, and what could have been different. Joe stayed on the porch, still, with that faraway look he always wore. The one that made it seem like he was watching something beyond the present moment. Ryan knew his grandfather wasn't waiting for him to speak. Joe was waiting for him to think. And for a boy who had always reacted too fast, that was the real challenge. Around 4 in the afternoon, Ryan finally walked toward the door. Not to obey, not to please, but because something inside him didn't want to run anymore. The sun hit from the side, lighting up the crooked mark that had been there since the morning. It was small, insignificant to any adult. But to Ryan, now, it felt like a trace of his own loss of control. His face grew warm, not from anger, but from awareness. "Looks like it's been staring you down all day," Joe said, with no hint of sarcasm. Ryan didn't answer. He just stared at the dent. He didn't like it. He didn't like what it said about him. "Grandpa." Why Why does it hurt so much to look at this?" Joe scratched his white beard. "Because this is the first time you're really seeing what anger does." Ryan swallowed hard. "I didn't want to hurt anyone." "Most people who cause damage and anger don't want to either," his grandfather said. "But anger doesn't ask. It just barges in and grabs the wheel." Ryan took a deep breath, the kind that felt like it carried the entire day inside it. And then, like someone stepping out of a dark place, he raised his hand and touched the door. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt like a ritual. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Joe heard it. The world heard it. And strangely, that small word made more noise inside Ryan than the kick he'd thrown that morning. But the boy didn't stop there. He looked at the door, then at his own hands, and finally at Joe. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," his face burning, "for yelling and for everything I said." Joe didn't smile, didn't hug him, didn't celebrate. He simply nodded. "Now you're talking to the right person." That was it. Small, simple, profound. Ryan felt a strange wave inside him, a lightness he didn't recognize. It was as if he'd finally set down something he'd been carrying without realizing it. He didn't know how to explain it, but it felt like growing up hurt and at the same time set him free. His grandfather stood up slowly, walked over to him, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Listen," Joe said, in that tone that carried definitive truth. "You're going to feel anger your whole life. I still feel it, but it only takes over if you let it." Ryan looked up. "And how do I not let it?" Joe took a deep breath, choosing his words with precision. "You do what you just did. You stop, you look, you face it, and you choose." "Choose what?" "Who you want to be after the anger." Ryan went quiet. He didn't fully understand, but he understood enough to know that this mattered. It mattered a lot. Joe continued, "There are people who spend their whole lives blaming everything and everyone for their own explosions. People who slam doors, who hurt the ones they love, who regret things far too late because they never learned to do what you did today." A chill ran through Ryan. "And me? You're still a kid, but today—" Joe squeezed his shoulder firmly. "Today you took a step many old men never had the courage to take." Ryan felt his chest expand, not with silly pride, but with something rare, the feeling of actually changing, truly changing on the inside. They stood there side by side, looking at the dent in the door, not as a shameful mark, but as a milestone, a deep footprint on the path toward maturity. The sun began to set, painting the sky orange and violet. The small town seemed to breathe slower, as if it too were wrapping up its own turbulent day. Joe sighed. "You know, Ryan, life's going to throw a lot of doors in your way. People getting on your nerves, things going wrong, losses, bad days, and you'll feel the urge to kick every single one of them." Ryan stayed quiet. "But," Joe went on, "if you remember this day, you'll realize that in the end, it's never about the doors. It's about you." The boy nodded. "I think I get it. You don't need to understand everything now. You just need to remember.
And then Joe did something he rarely did. He wrapped his arm around his grandson and pulled him into a short but genuine hug. "I'm proud of you," he murmured. When they stepped apart, Ryan seemed bigger, not physically, but in the way only people past 40 can recognize. That shine in the eyes of someone who's just learned a lesson that will follow them for a lifetime. It was the end of the day, but the beginning of something else. Ryan looked at the door one more time, and for the first time since sunrise, he smiled, because he understood, in a simple and quiet way, that anger is natural, but the choice is his. It always was, it always will be. And in that small American backyard, under a glowing sunset, a boy took his first step toward becoming the kind of man who doesn't destroy, but builds.